golden light of the gala chandelier shattered against the crystal glass in Amelia's hand. But her eyes were fixed on the heavy oak door at the end of the hall. Behind her, the rhythmic clinking of silverware and the low hum of elite small talk felt like a countdown. She could still feel the phantom weight of the skeleton key she'd stolen that morning, its jagged teeth pressing a secret bruise into her palm. One floor above, her husband's laughter boomed, a rich, commanding sound that made the other guests lean in, unaware that the man they admired had just signed the papers to have his wife forcibly removed in the morning. A sharp vibration pulsed against her thigh, a hidden phone, a signal from a world Edward didn't control. Amelia felt the thick layer of concealer on her cheekbone crack as she forced a socialite smile, her gaze meeting Edward's across the room. He raised his glass to her, a gesture of absolute ownership, his eyes tracking the slight tremor in her fingers. The security guards at the perimeter shifted their weight, their radios crackling with a sudden, frantic burst of static. In that moment, the polished marble floor felt like thin ice, and the first hairline fracture was already spreading toward the man at the center of the room. Amelia Thornton stood before the floor-to-ceiling mahogany mirror in the grand foyer of Elmwood Academy, her fingers tracing the sharp, white line of her starched collar. Every fiber of her attire broadcasted a narrative of unshakable stability. The silk of her blouse remained crisp, resisting the humid Boston morning, while her chestnut hair rested in a bun so tight it seemed to pull the very thoughts from her brain. Through the arched windows of the hallway, the neo-Gothic spires of the campus clawed at a gray sky, casting long, jagged shadows across the checkerboard marble floor. A wealthy couple approached, their faces etched with the peculiar brand of anxiety common to parents whose children were failing to meet the expectations of a legacy. Amelia pivoted, her movement fluid and practiced. She offered a soft, rehearsed nod, the corners of her mouth twitching into a mask of professional empathy. "Mr. and Mrs. Sterling," she said, her voice a melodic hum that resonated with false calm. "Thank you for coming." As they spoke of their son's declining grades in Latin and his sudden withdrawal from the rowing team, Amelia kept her gaze fixed on them, nodding at precise intervals. Beneath the heavy oak table, hidden from their sight, her right hand gripped the carved edge of the wood until the grain bit into her palm. The pain acted as an anchor, preventing her mind from drifting to the dull, rhythmic pulse thumping against her left temple. She felt the weight of the foundation she had applied that morning. A thick, clinical layer of concealer designed to mask the yellowish bruise ripening on her cheekbone. It was a souvenir from the previous night, a mark left by Edward's hand when he had gripped her face to ensure she was listening to his critique of her dinner service. Amelia picked up her fountain pen, the gold nib scratching an elegant, looping note in the student's file. Her hand shook, a fine tremor she suppressed by locking her elbow against her ribs. She spoke of cognitive behavioral shifts and adolescent adjustment periods, her words flowing like honey, while the scent of old paper and expensive floor wax threatened to choke her. In this room, she was the authority, the pillar of the Elmwood elite. She was the main ornament of a prestigious institution, a woman whose life appeared as polished as the silver trophies in the glass cases outside her door. The grandfather clock in the Thornton hallway struck 19 hours and 5 minutes with a heavy, judgmental chime. Amelia stepped over the threshold, her heels clicking softly on the stone floor. She didn't need to check the time. The sudden drop in the room's temperature told her everything. Edward Thornton stood in the center of the vast living room, a silhouette of absolute control framed by the darkening windows of Roxbury. He didn't turn. He simply stood with his arms folded across his chest, his shadow stretching long and thin across the dining table. In the center of the lace tablecloth, a roasted duck sat beneath a silver cloche, its steam long since vanished, the fat congealing into a white, waxy film. Edward slowly pivoted, his movement deliberate. He didn't look at her face first. His eyes traveled to the clock, then down to her shoes, and finally up to meet her gaze. His gray eyes were chips of flint, cold and devoid of the warmth he displayed at the firm. 5 minutes, Amelia, he said. The words were quiet, a low vibration that seemed to rattle the crystal decanters on the sideboard. The traffic on Boylston was... I don't want excuses. I want an account. He began to pace, a predator measuring the cage. He demanded a detailed report of every stoplight, every construction delay, every minor inconvenience that had conspired to make her late for the ritual of their evening meal. Amelia felt the moisture vanish from her throat. She tried to swallow, but her tongue felt like a piece of dry wool. Edward's voice remained level, a measured, icy tone that was far more terrifying than a shout. He listed her transgressions: the disrespect for his schedule, the disregard for the staff's labor, the erosion of the domestic order he provided. He took a step toward her, his presence expanding until he occupied all the air in the room. Amelia retreated until her spine pressed against the cold, brass handle of the front door. She lowered her head, her eyes tracing the intricate patterns of the Persian rug, counting the threads to keep from crying. Above her, Edward's voice continued, a lecture on the sanctity of family traditions and her failure to uphold them. Inside the breakfast nook, the morning sun struggled to penetrate the heavy velvet drapes. Edward sat opposite her, the silver spoon in his hand, moving in a steady, rhythmic circle as he stirred sugar into her tea. The clink of the metal against the fine bone china was a rhythmic assault, each strike echoing in the silence of the house. He stopped stirring and reached across the table. His hand, warm and heavy, settled on her knee. Amelia flinched, a small, involuntary jerk that caused her tea to slop over the rim of her cup. Edward didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned in, his face inches from hers, his breath smelling of peppermint and expensive espresso. "You're so scattered lately, darling," he whispered, his voice dripping with a terrifying, manufactured concern. "You left the stove on again yesterday. And the bills? You missed the payment date for the insurance. Again." "I didn't," Amelia whispered, her voice cracking. "I remember putting the envelope in the..." Edward sighed, a heavy, theatrical sound of disappointment. He pulled a small, leather-bound notebook from his breast pocket. He flipped through the pages, his finger pausing on a list of dates and times, meticulous records of her supposed failures. "Your memory is failing you, Amelia. It's that hereditary fragility. Your mother had it too, near the end." Amelia felt the room begin to tilt. The walls of the kitchen seemed to lean inward, the floral wallpaper becoming a blur of distorted colors. "I think we should increase the dosage of your sedatives," Edward continued, his thumb stroking her kneecap in a way that made her skin crawl. "Just until you find your footing again." He looked at her then, and Amelia saw no love, no empathy. There was only a cold, calculating pity, the look of a scientist observing a specimen that was failing to thrive under laboratory conditions. The afternoon air in the North End was sharp, carrying the scent of roasting coffee and salt from the harbor. Amelia stepped into a small boutique patisserie, the bell above the door chiming with a cheerful ring that felt at odds with the leaden weight in her chest. She needed a moment of normalcy, a single pastry that Edward hadn't approved or calculated into her caloric intake. She reached into her leather clutch and pulled out a gold plastic card, sliding it across the marble counter toward the teenage girl behind the register. "Just the lemon tart, please," Amelia said, forcing a small smile. The girl swiped the card. A second later, the terminal emitted a sharp, grating screech. A red box flashed on the screen. Transaction declined. Amelia's heart gave a sickening thud. Try it again? I think the chip might be dirty. She watched as the girl swiped it a second time, then a third. The result was the same. Amelia's fingers went numb, her coordination deserting her as she tried to help, hitting the wrong buttons on the keypad. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the cashier said, her voice rising just enough to alert the 3 people waiting in line behind Amelia. "It says the account is blocked by the primary holder." Heat flooded Amelia's neck, a burning tide of humiliation. She could feel the impatient shifting of the people behind her, the muffled sighs, the judgmental stares. She snatched the card back, shoving it into her wallet. A quick glance inside confirmed what she already knew. There was no cash. Not a single dollar. Edward hadn't said a word. He hadn't warned her. He had simply reached out and severed her connection to the world with a few keystrokes. She stood in the middle of the shop, the sweet smell of sugar turning nauseating, realizing that she could no longer even buy a cup of tea without his explicit permission. The following morning, the house was silent, save for the muffled roar of the wind against the stone facade. Edward stood before the hallway mirror, his movements brisk and efficient as he donned his charcoal overcoat. He checked his Rolex, the metal glinting in the dim light of the foyer. He turned to Amelia, offering a dry, perfunctory kiss to her forehead. His lips felt like ice against her skin. "I'll be late tonight. The Miller merger is hitting a snag," he said, his voice already miles away, focused on the firm. He stepped out, the heavy oak door thudding shut with a finality that echoed through the empty rooms. Amelia stood still, her breath hitching in the silence. Then she saw it. Hanging from the brass peg of the coat rack was Edward's spare suit jacket. Peeking out from the inner breast pocket was a thin silver chain, at the end of which sat a heavy, intricate skeleton key. Amelia froze. Her ears rang with the sound of Edward's car pulling out of the gravel driveway, the engine noise fading into the distance. She stared at the key. It was the one he never left behind, the one that guarded the only room in the house she was forbidden to enter, his private study. She reached out, her hand trembling so violently she had to steady it with the other. Her fingers brushed the cold metal. It felt heavy, a physical manifestation of the secrets he kept. She pulled it from the pocket, the chain clinking softly. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone as she clutched the key in her palm. The jagged teeth of the metal bit into her skin, but she didn't let go. Amelia stood before the massive oak door of the study, the shadow of the hallway engulfing her. The wood was dark, polished to a mirror shine, reflecting her own terrified expression. She slid the key into the lock. It resisted for a heartbeat, then turned with a heavy, metallic groan that sounded like a scream in the quiet house. She slipped inside. The air was thick with the scent of stale tobacco and the musk of old leather. It was a man's room, oppressive and grand. A single shaft of gray light from the street lamp outside pierced the gloom, illuminating the vast desk that sat like an altar in the center of the room. Amelia dropped to her knees behind the desk, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. She went for the bottom drawer, her fingers scrambling against the wood. It was locked. She used the skeleton key again, her movements frantic. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind against the glass made her jump. She felt a film of cold, sticky sweat break out on her forehead. She began to pull out folders, her eyes scanning documents she didn't understand, legal briefs, corporate filings, property deeds. She was looking for herself. She was looking for the paper trail of the woman she used to be. She forced herself to breathe, fighting the overwhelming urge to bolt back to the safety of her bedroom and pretend this had never happened. Her fingers brushed against a small, nearly invisible wooden tab at the very back of the bottom drawer. She pulled it. With a dry, satisfying click, a false bottom popped up, revealing a slim, gray folder. Amelia pulled it out. The paper was old, slightly yellowed at the edges, and bore the embossed crest of the bank where her father had kept his life savings. Her breath caught. She opened the folder. Inside were rows of meticulous ledgers, columns of figures, and encrypted codes. As she flipped through the pages, the smell of the paper hit her, a scent of decay and hidden things. She saw transfers, dozens of them, totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars. The dates made her stomach turn. They started years ago, shortly after her father's funeral, long before she had even known there was a significant inheritance to claim. She stared at the official seals, the bank stamps, the signatures. Edward's name was everywhere, woven into the fabric of her father's estate like a parasite. He hadn't just managed her life. He had been harvesting her past. Amelia spread the documents across the dark rug, her knees digging into the pile. She began to cross-reference the dates on the transfer orders with the calendar of their first year of marriage. There, on a deed for a beach house in Maine she had never visited, was her name. It was written in a beautiful, flowing script. A perfect imitation of her own handwriting, but with a slight, unnatural tilt to the letters. The memory hit her like a physical blow. The honeymoon in Tuscany, the hazy afternoons filled with expensive champagne and Edward's constant, doting attention. He had brought her papers to sign, insurance forms, he'd said, or boring estate tax waivers. She had been so happy, so our-named by his love, that she had signed whatever he put in front of her. She traced the forged flourish of her surname with a trembling finger. A cold, crystalline rage began to wake up deep in her chest, replacing the fear. He had waited until she was at her most vulnerable, until she was blinded by the illusion of a perfect life, to strip her of everything she owned. Every "I love you" had been a distraction while he picked her pockets. She dug deeper into the hidden compartment and found a separate, hand-drawn grid. At the top, in Edward's precise, legalistic hand, was her name, Amelia Thornton. It wasn't a financial ledger. It was a behavioral one. She read the entries with a growing sense of horror. October 14th. Induced disorientation regarding car keys. Subject showed expected anxiety. November 2nd. Gaslighted regarding dinner invitation. Subject apologized for forgetting. There were notes on the medications he was giving her, the vitamins he insisted she take every morning. He was documenting the slow erosion of her will, a 5-year plan that ended with a chilling notation. Final phase. Complete incapacity. Transfer to St. Jude's closed pavilion. The room seemed to shrink. Amelia realized she wasn't just a wife or a source of income to him. She was a project. He was systematically deleting her identity, creating a paper trail of madness so that when he finally locked her away, no one would question it. The scale of the trap was breathtaking. He had turned the very walls of her home into a laboratory, and she was the only subject. The sudden, sharp sound of a key turning in the front door lock shattered the silence. Amelia bolted upright, her heart leaping into her throat. She heard the heavy thud of Edward's boots on the hardwood of the foyer, followed by the casual, terrifying sound of him whistling a soft tune. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her system. She scrambled to gather the papers, her hands shaking so much she nearly tore the fragile sheets. She shoved them into the gray folder, fumbled with the false bottom, and slammed the drawer shut. She scanned the floor, her eyes darting wildly to ensure no scrap of paper remained. She smoothed her skirt, her breath coming in jagged gasps, and slipped out of the study just as the light in the hallway flickered on. She barely managed to move away from the door before Edward turned the corner. Amelia pressed her back against the cool oak of the study door, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She waited for the telltale click of the latch, Her breath held until her lungs burned. The hallway was a tunnel of shadows, the only light a dim amber glow from the foyer. She moved with the silent grace of a ghost, her palms skimming the silk-papered walls as she navigated the familiar path to the living room. She collapsed into the wingback chair, pulling a heavy wool throw over her legs just as Edward's footsteps transitioned from the foyer to the hardwood of the hall. The sound was rhythmic, predatory. He appeared in the doorway, the light from the hall casting his shadow long across the rug. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, slowly peeling his leather gloves off, one finger at a time. His gray eyes were narrowed, scanning the room with the precision of a hawk. They settled on Amelia's face. She kept her gaze fixed on the open book in her lap, though the words were nothing more than blurred ink. "You're up late," he said. His voice was a low crawl. "I couldn't sleep," she replied, her voice sounding thin and brittle to her own ears. Edward took a deep breath, his nostrils flaring. He was searching for something. The faint, lingering scent of his own tobacco that she must have carried out of the study on her clothes. He lingered for a heartbeat too long, the silence stretching until it felt like a physical weight. The next evening, Edward returned with a small, heavy box. Without a word, he set it on the granite island in the kitchen. It was a sleek, black sphere, the lens of a high-definition camera staring out like a mechanical eye. He plugged it in, and a tiny red LED flickered to life, tracking Amelia's movement as she moved toward the sink. Edward wiped his hands on a linen towel, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've hired a specialist, Amelia," he said, his tone deceptively gentle. "A private observer, to ensure your safety when I'm not here. Given your recent episodes of confusion, I think it's for the best." Amelia gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. She looked at the camera, then back at him. It wasn't about safety. It was a perimeter. Edward reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick, embossed business card. It featured a stylized eye. He slid it across the stone toward her. "Mr. Clark is very discreet," Edward added. To Amelia, the camera didn't look like a security device. It looked like the barrel of a gun, a constant, unblinking threat that would record every flinch, every tear, every moment of her life until there was nowhere left to hide. The air in the basement of Elmwood Academy's science wing was thick with the smell of formaldehyde and the dry rot of old textbooks. Amelia sat on a lab stool, surrounded by the skeletal remains of birds and jars of preserved specimens. Across from her, the blue light of a laptop illuminated the sharp, angular face of Lisa Mackenzie. Lisa was a ghost of Elmwood's past, a brilliant student whose father's construction firm had been dismantled by Edward's legal maneuvering. Her fingers danced across the keys with a frantic, rhythmic intensity. "He's good, Amelia. I'll give him that," Lisa whispered, her voice rasping in the quiet room. "The firewalls are military grade, but everyone leaves a back door." Amelia watched the scrolling lines of code, feeling a strange, dark kinship with the girl. They were both casualties of the same man, united by a shared wreckage. Lisa looked up, her green eyes reflecting the data on the screen. "He thinks he's invisible," Lisa said, a jagged smile touching her lips. "But he's just loud." Amelia reached into her bag and pulled out the stack of photos she had taken of the ledgers in the study. She laid them on the scarred wooden lab bench. Lisa's eyes widened as she scanned the figures. "This is it," Lisa breathed, her voice dropping to a sharp hiss. "These aren't just accounts. These are the routing numbers for the offshore shells. He's been moving the money through a series of dummy corporations in the Caymans." Amelia felt a surge of adrenaline. "Can you get in?" Lisa looked at the photos, then back at her screen. "I don't just want to get in, Amelia. I want to burn the house down." The ball at the Thornton estate was a masterpiece of manufactured elegance. 1,000 crystal shards from the massive chandeliers fractured the light, scattering it across a sea of polished parquetry. Fachanti and white gloves moved like clockwork, their silver trays laden with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The air was a suffocating blend of expensive lilies and floor wax. Amelia stood in the center of the room, her spine so straight it felt as though it might snap. She could feel the weight of Edward's gaze from the mezzanine balcony. He was a gargoyle perched above his kingdom, watching her every move. She saw her reflection in a gilded mirror, a pale, hollowed-out version of herself, draped in sapphire silk. Then, she saw him. Edward began to descend the wide marble staircase, his eyes locked on hers, never once blinking. He moved with the slow, terrifying confidence of a man who knew the exit was barred. He reached her, and the scent of his cologne, leather and bitter tobacco, overwhelmed the lilies. His hand, hot and dry, settled on her collarbone. He adjusted the heavy sapphire necklace she wore, his fingers grazing her skin in a way that felt like a slow-motion strangulation. "You look exquisite, Amelia," he whispered, leaning so close his breath tickled her ear. "A shame you won't be able to enjoy the house for much longer. The car for St. Jude's arrives at dawn. They're expecting you." Amelia felt a tremor start in her knees. He leaned back, smiling for a passing photographer, his hand lingering on her neck as if marking his territory. He clicked the small safety catch on the necklace. The sound, a final, metallic lock. She looked toward the technical booth near the stage. There, hidden under a dark hoodie, was Lisa. She was adjusting a microphone stand, her movements quick and nervous. She looked up and gave Amelia a single, sharp nod. It was the signal. The code was in. But as Amelia watched, Lisa's expression changed. She pressed a hand to her earpiece, her face contorting into a mask of sudden panic. She looked at the laptop on the console and then back at Amelia, her hand forming a tight fist against her chest. System fail. The realization hit Amelia like a physical blow. The new security protocols Edward had mentioned, the discreet Mr. Clark, must have been more sophisticated than Lisa had anticipated. The digital trap was failing. Edward gripped her elbow, his fingers digging into the bone, and began to lead her toward a group of city officials. He spoke of her delicate constitution and his unfortunate duty to oversee her care. Every word was a lie, every smile a jagged blade. Amelia felt like a specimen in a glass case, being exhibited for the last time before being moved to permanent storage. Suddenly, Edward's grip tightened. He steered her away from the crowd and into the cold silence of the library, slamming the heavy doors behind them. He didn't waste time. He threw a single sheet of paper onto the desk, a court-ordered psychiatric commitment form. "It's over, Amelia," he snarled, the mask of the doting husband finally falling away to reveal the monster beneath. "The ambulance is at the service entrance. You're leaving now." Amelia reached into the folds of her silk skirt, her fingers finding the small, hard plastic of the hidden transmitter Lisa had given her. She clicked the button. A tiny green light pulsed against her thigh. She stepped toward him, her voice trembling but clear. "How much did you steal, Edward? How many signatures did you forge?" Edward laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "All of them. Every cent your father left. And tomorrow, I'll have the power of attorney to finish the job. You're a madwoman, Amelia. No one will ever believe a word you say," he went on, fueled by the arrogance of his perceived victory, detailing the medications, the bribes to the doctors at St. Jude's, and the exact path of the money. He didn't see the tiny microphone hidden in the lace of her bodice. He didn't know that every word was being broadcasted to Lisa's recorder. Suddenly, Edward froze. He looked at the security console on the wall. The monitors were flickering, the camera feeds from the ballroom spinning in erratic circles. He grabbed his radio, his face darkening. "Lock the doors, no one leaves," he roared. The sound of heavy, automated bolts slamming shut echoed through the house. The windows were covered by steel shutters, cutting them off from the world. Edward turned to Amelia, the truth finally dawning in his eyes. "What have you done?" Amelia didn't answer. She turned and ran, flinging the library doors open and bursting back into the ballroom. She headed straight for the center of the room, where the mayor and the chief of police stood. "Edward!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the music. "Tell them about the Cayman accounts. Tell them about the forged deeds." The music died. 100 pairs of eyes turned to her. Edward burst into the room behind her, his face a mask of primal rage. He lunged for her, but she dodged, her voice rising over the gasps of the guests. "Ask him about the transfer he made this morning. Ask him about St. Jude's." At that moment, Lisa hit the final key. The massive digital screen surrounding the ballroom flickered. The elegant slideshow of the Thornton family's charitable works vanished, replaced by a scrolling ledger of offshore accounts. Then, the audio hit. Edward's voice, cold, arrogant, and murderous, boomed through the professional sound system. "Every cent your father left, you're a madwoman. No one will ever believe you." The guests stood frozen, their faces reflecting the blue light of the screens. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of Edward's recorded confession. Edward let out a guttural roar, the sound of a cornered animal. He charged at Amelia, his fist cocked back. He swung with everything he had, the blow narrowly missing her head as she ducked. He collided with the buffet table, sending a mountain of crystal and silver crashing to the floor. He scrambled up, his eyes bloodshot, his face a distorted wreck of the man he had been. He reached for her throat, but the crowd had already begun to move. The chief of police stepped forward, his hand on his holster. Amelia backed away, watching as the empire of Edward Thornton crumbled in the light of the truth. She didn't look back as she walked toward the open doors, leaving the golden cage behind forever.